Well, of all the TPLF leaders, the person that I met very late is Mala Zenawi. So my interaction with him was from summer 1990 until 1993-94 when we separated course. Nonetheless, the person is a voracious reader who can absorb information readily, extensively. He enjoys debating, but hates losing. He was a thinker, basically. He was a visionary also, in short.
Mm. Thank you. Professor Alex, in this book that I just mentioned, The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, you describe Zenawi as the ablest political intellectuals of his generation. You also call him one of the region's most important political thinkers. You state that you have known him for nearly 25 years. You also talk about a specific moment when you met him for the first time in this book. Can you tell us a little bit more about this encounter with him for the first time and the kind of person that he was at a personal level?
My first meeting with Meles, whom I was introduced to as Comrade Meles, was as the sun was setting at the Sudanese border in 1988, and I was crossing the border to go to Tigray to do some work on an agricultural rehabilitation program in areas of Tigray controlled by TPLF, though of course the war against the Derg was still on at its height at that stage. And I met Comrade Meles as I clambered on board a captured Soviet-built truck that had been taken from the Derg. And we traveled overnight through the next day, where we camped under the trees to shelter from the aerial bombardment, and then over the next night. And it was like being in a traveling seminar. There was him, there were several other leaders of TPLF, myself and one other, and the entire time we were discussing issues of political economy, of the role of the peasants, of what was happening in the world, of perestroika and things like that. And Meles came across as somebody who was a very, very able intellectual, a debater, someone who was a Marxist-Leninist through and through in the way that he analyzed problems. Who, when he spoke as though his whole paragraph, his whole argument was formed in his head before he began to speak. And so he was an extremely able interlocutor. And I had some great discussions with him. I agreed on some things, disagreed on others. I learned a lot. I found it very hard to influence his thinking. He was already he'd already figured out most of the issues that we were debating, including the ones on which I quite profoundly disagreed with him. But it was the beginning of an intellectual friendship that lasted and until the time of his death, and one that I valued.
Mr. Leenco, you have taken part in some of the early negotiations during the transition. You also played a part in the transitional government and also the discussion prior to the transitional government. And as we know, the kind of policy or conceptual architecture for the current Ethiopian states was basically laid down in that document, which is the transitional charter. I wanted to ask you, what was Meles's role in designing that document? To what extent is the outcome, that is the transitional document, influenced by him, or were there other actors who contributed to that outcome?
Well, the three organizations, OLF, TPLF, EPLF, where the schedule to bring their leaders together was made in London at the end of the so-called London Conference. It was suggested by today's president of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki. So when we got together finally in a town called Sana'a, Isaias had small notes concerning Eritrea. His views were very simple. It is how to systematically disengage from Ethiopia. He presented that and then turned to Mallas and asked him, what about for Ethiopia? There was a document that the TPLF had published on the transitional arrangement prior to the meeting, so it was a public information. And he started reciting those. At this stage, President Isaias turned to me and asked me what our views would be, and I had rough notes on foolscap paper for the outline of the document that later on became the charter. Our leader, President Isaias, immediately said, let's work on that. So from then on, the document that I presented became the basis for discussion. That discussion culminated in drafting the national charter. Talking to Mallas, he writing something on a piece of paper, a lot of interpretation has been given to that photograph. It was actually a moment when I was telling him that the territories of the various nations should be clearly delineated, this to be added to the charter. Mm-hmm. So basically, the outline for the charter was the brainchild of the OLF.
All right, right. Professor Duval, you, as I said earlier, you know Mallas very well. You seem to know his thinking both politically and also economically. To what extent do you think Mallas influences the current architecture in Ethiopia, the economic, political, constitutional design of the Ethiopian state?
I think he had a profound influence. I mean, I think Mallas was a superb strategic thinker and also an excellent tactician, so that he quite often was able to get his way politically through the various institutions of the state, but also the party, the EPLF, etc., through his grasp of tactical issues, so he could outmaneuver his opponents. And in order to do that, he was often disguised what he was doing. So so sometimes you would see him advancing a position which wasn't necessarily the position that he really believed in. And what you see in the structure of EPLF, TPLF, and the MLLT, the Marxist-Leninist League of Tigray, is that yes, he himself was a Marxist-Leninist, but he stopped talking about the MLLT. And one of the issues I find most fascinating, and it's an issue on which, for me, is unresolved, is Mallas's own position on the issue of nations and nationalities. And I should say the reason why I dedicated my book to the memory of Mallas is over the years, 25 years that I knew him, we had a series of conversations. And he promised that when he stepped down from office, and he promised he was going to do that, he would write a book about the democratic developmental state and his vision for Ethiopia. And I had a critique of that book. And I was going to also write my critique. And because he passed away before he was able to do that, what I did was I published my book, The Real Politics, which includes an analysis and a critique an incomplete critique of his view. And I say this is an incomplete task, because what I really wanted to do was to hear him properly unfold his views, which he never did when he was in office. He said he would only really be able to do that after he'd retired from office. Then we would really know what he believed and what he argued, and then I would be able to do the same. So it is, as it were, a project that was unfinished and can never be finished. But the point that I want to focus on here is I never got clarity on what exactly he meant by nations and nationality. Because I asked him about the federal constitution and the fact that it had, it gave rights, including self-determination to different national groups within Ethiopia. And I said, where does this come from? He said, well, it comes from the Marxist-Leninist theory of nations and nationalities. And of course, that the original text on that was written by Joseph Stalin in 1913, but never fully adopted by Lenin. Lenin was always a little bit ambivalent about it. And if you read and he said, and we adopted it because we had no political alternative at the time. He said it came from the OLF. We needed the OLF. Of course, later on they said they didn't need the OLF, but at the time they needed OLF. They would have not been able to consolidate the transition in 1991 without OLF being there. There's no question about it. And so then the question arises, well, you have this definition in Stalin's definition, which talks about language and territory and shared culture. But then Stalin goes on to a second sentence, which is never quoted, which is, he says, nations are a product of history, and like all products of history, they rise and fall. Now, this means that the nations as they exist at a particular time are a product of a particular history. So if you take that theory seriously, history moves on. A lot happens in the intervening period. Ethiopia is being transformed. Whether you like it or not, it is changing. So what does that mean for the nations and nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia? I never got an answer to that question. I was promised an answer. It wasn't that he refused to give one. It was that we ran out of time because he passed away. So this, for me, is one of the unanswered questions about whether the current constitutional order, in the mind of Meles, was work in progress or it was something fixed. Hello, Awal, have we lost you?
He's gone.
Aha.
Frozen.
He's coming back.
Inshallah. You speak Arabic, right?
I speak enough to understand, inshallah. But I mean, maybe to just continue the conversation, he was candid that EPLF needed OLF at that point, and that much of this agenda was taken from OLF. His tactical calculation appears to have changed, or no, maybe not him, but the EPLF leadership as a whole.
You see, actually, in one way, the path that they were charting in the 1980s was clear. A Marxist-Leninist leadership for Ethiopia, a vanguard party. Then you can devolve power to the various regions, however you define them, but maintain the central control exactly like the CPSU.
Yes.
Unfortunately, toward this, as he was coming to power, the CPSU lost power. And you couldn't openly say, okay, we are Marxist-Leninist guy.
Yeah. But the model, it's interesting that the model you describe is absolutely correct, because the problem that EPLF has now about his party and all the everything that has been adopted at regional level by their client party, they've just taken the same. There's no diversity in how the constituent federal states run themselves, and this, of course, is a complete antithesis of really what federalism and the right to, including the right to self-determination, ought to be. And it is on this point, I think, that the country is in danger of tearing itself apart.
Yeah, that is a controversy that resulted not from their choice, but from how the world politics evolved exactly at the moment they were coming to power. It was very clear they never wanted the OLF permanently. They needed us to frustrate or to cow the Amhara elite. This big stick problem.
Okay, I apologize. I basically freezed, and then I had a signal that said that there's something wrong with your audio. So I have to get out, and then I couldn't come back, and we had that noise. So we'll just continue, and I apologize for our viewers online. I was about to ask it was creation or description, a complete idea of what those means, and he didn't have clarity on the project.
In a way, yes, because the charter was drafted in Eritrea. We think clearly laid down parameters. By the time I returned to Wallaga and through that came to Addis Ababa, a lot had changed. For example, the TPLF had gone out and inviting elites from the various southern groups to organize themselves. And overnight there were organizations representing the Kambata, the Hadiya, and so on and so forth. This created a crisis of some sort that TPLF actually, or Mallas himself, managed very well. These groups were antagonistic to each other, and that could be exploited. The other thing is that the difficulty was that the TPLF leadership, including Mallas, could not anymore adhere to the vanguard party for USSR. This example, groups like the OPD are supposed to rule Oromia, Andem is to rule Amhara area, but under strict centralized guidance. Now, so long as he was alive and actively leading, he could exert a lot of influence on these institutions. But once he was removed from the scene, difficulties arose. Let me explain it differently. Mallas sat as the juncture where the civil and military institutions intersected, as well as the state and party institutions. He knew all four. He had such a stature that he could orchestrate all four of these very important institutions. Once he was not there anymore, whoever succeeded him, unless they had the same kind of stature, the orchestration of these four institutions would break down. I think we are starting to see that.
I'll definitely come back to this point toward the end of our conversation. I want to come back to you again, Mr. Leenco. In your 1999 book, the Ethiopian State at Crossroads, you talk about how national liberation fronts at the time in Ethiopia were very much animated and informed by a Maoist understanding of politics, the party, state, society relations, and so on and so forth. And you talk about how TPLF and Mallas were basically unable to stomach the idea that they can transfer power at a ballot box, precisely because of that Maoist understanding. I wanted to ask you, to what extent Mallas subscribed to that ideology while in power?
Incidentally, I have yet to see any Ethiopian leader showing any willingness to hand over power peacefully. And this is the problem I have also with the opposition, even now. That is one. Number two, regarding our Maoist background, there was a reason for it. the formula, the writings of Mao led one generation of third world revolutionaries. And we had reasons to believe in its miraculous capacity to deliver victory. We grew up at a time when the Vietnam War was going on. A small, backward society fighting the mightiest nation on earth and prevailing. If the Vietnamese could do it against such a mighty power, we could do it to a backward Mengistu Haile Mariam. That is the calculation, and that is why we had to study that. More than post-power. After you capture power, what will happen? Very likely all of us would have designed ourselves, reinvented ourselves as a vanguard party in the trend that then was very popular.
If I could come in on this, I think,
yes.
I mean, in my discussions with Melis on democracy, we debated a lot the democratic developmental state, and I said, I can see the development, you can see the roads, the bridges, et cetera, et cetera. Where is the democracy? And his candid answer actually was that democracy, as we understand it, has to wait. Democracy, in terms of a competitive democracy, if it is introduced today in Ethiopia, he said the rent seekers will win. The rent seekers who just are interested in power in order to line their own pockets for their own political, factional issues, not for the good of the nation. Those are the people who will win. And he singled out the opposition in 2005 as being exemplary of that. He said what we need is another 15 years of accelerated growth. And by which time, when Ethiopia becomes a middle-income country, then he says, then it's possible to have a transition towards a democratic system in which you can have competitive elections, and with a level playing field in which one party will not mind ceding power to another. And he was candid that EPLF is not going to cede power unless there is another party that is contending that also has basically the same vision of developmental, democratic developmental Ethiopia. Mm. And you may agree or disagree with it, but it is a coherent point of view and one that's worth certainly taking into consideration.
I have two problems with Melis once released the conclusion chapters of a forthcoming book. Mm. So he made it very difficult for us. If we keep quiet, we go along with it. Mm-hmm. If we create inadequate information. So I did something. I tried to criticize him out after he passed away, one chapter in an edited book on the developmental state. Mm-hmm. I have three problems with that article. Number one, on the issue of in Ethiopia under the leadership of the TPLF. Number two, the countries he quotes, South Korea, Germany, Japan, these were more or less homogeneous societies in which the party that led, the force that led development had high level of legitimacy, and which the EPLF never really won, in my opinion. Finally, in this article that I'm talking about, he says the developmental state must maintain its autonomy by relying on the armed forces and police. Basically, a military government. That is what it means. And if we study developmental state, the history of the developmental state, there is an alternative type of autonomy, embedded autonomy. And he never mentioned that. I'm sure he was aware of it, but he never mentioned even to criticize it. That is the fundamental problem I have with Mallas.
I want to come back to you, Professor Duval. Shortly after Mallas passed away in December of 2012, you published a piece basically looking at Mallas's developmental state theory. The piece was titled The Theory and Practice of Mallas Zenawi, where I think you discussed that piece very approvingly, essentially endorsing most of the central tenets that Mallas put forward in that piece. And Mallas's central tenet, as you said, is that the primary principle is economic development. Political freedoms and democracy are subsidiary to economic development. And he has stated on several occasions that there is simply no causal relationship between democracy and economic growth. Do you actually believe in that claim, that there is no nexus at all?
I think the issue is a lot more complicated. I think that I do agree with the view that relates to the issue of democratization is much more complicated.
Is it possible that he is probably putting forward that agenda because that is the only way that Mallas can remain at the top, given the architecture in the country? Is that possible?
I think there are two issues there. There's one issue is how he prevailed internally within EPLF and TPLF during the internal crisis of 2000, 2001. And the second is how the reconstituted EPLF leadership, which emerged from that, remained in control of Ethiopia, especially after the crisis of 2005. And I wouldn't personalize it quite in that way, because he was in charge of Ethiopia. He was not a dictator in the sense of Omar al-Bashir or Mengistu. It's a very different form of authoritarian and centralized control, because he has an agenda. He is setting an agenda, not just pursuing power for its own sake.
He's not a dictator, not even post TPLF.
No, the terms are misleading. Okay. Normally, when you talk about a dictator is someone who seeks power for its own sake. Okay. Mallas obviously wanted power for himself and his party, but he had an agenda. He had an agenda to transform Ethiopia. Now, you may agree or disagree with that, but that puts him separate from those who are simply in power because they want power. There is a difference, and that is the difference, and it is an important difference.
Leenco, what do you make of that?
Well, during the struggle, we used to contrast the TPLF with the EPLF. In the EPLF, the top leader had already emerged as the most decisive person very early. And in the TPLF, the Politburo was a collegiate body. They debated issues exhaustively. They could run marathon meetings. It was a meeting of equals. They were about the same age. They're roughly from the same elementary school. And until the internal crisis. After that, I met one of them, one of those who lost, and asked him, explained to him that we always felt and admired the collegiate kind of leadership that the TPLF leaders had. And now, after you guys have been expelled, what does it look like? His answer was very simple. Deliberations in the TPLF Politburo now look like a teacher lecturing a group of pupils. I think that did emerge. Now, power for what? Alex says not for its own sake. Meles left the power, no question about it. And he did not like people disagreeing with him publicly. He could disagree with you, debate with you privately. But in public, you have to toe the line. Whether you call that dictatorship or not, that is your dictionary that will solve that.
Okay. Let me, because I'm going to have to go very shortly, let me just come back on that point. There definitely was a transition. And there was a collegiate leadership until 2000, 2001. And I mean, one of the things that was very striking during the second period after that, when I continued to meet with Meles, was that he would debate with people like me, with outsiders. He would not have those debates with Ethiopians. And his interaction with Ethiopians was exactly as